we're going to focus mainly on Catholic social thought today, and of course Dorothy Day is a very important part of that because she practiced it in every way possible, even to the discomfort, I think, of the official church. So we will touch a bit, I'm sure, with Tom Cornell on anti-war, but we did that last time, if you recall. So my focus today certainly is going to be on Catholic social thought, and again, this is a series to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. And the Vatican Council had something to say about Catholic social thought, which Msgr. LoPinto will bring us forward on that. One other thing, Professor Horowitz, okay, I don't want to take credit for this series. It was actually started by Professor Arthur Hughes. And some of the senior citizens that are here know full well, you know, how entertaining he was, you know, when he began that series. So, with that said, I want to thank Professor Horowitz and Haviland for making their class available. And I also want to thank all of you, of course, for being here. I do want to tell my students that I should be teaching right now in my New York City history course to report after this lecture so I can take attendance. So you get credit, you see, for this presentation. Although we will be talking about New York City, so I'm trying to make it relevant also in that way. So it's been said that Catholic social thought is the best kept secret of the Catholic Church. Now, that may be true, but after speaking with some of my students after our first panel on Vatican II, that might well be the second best kept secret of the Church. So we're going to try to bring the two together today, and if we do as advertised, we're going to throw in Dorothy Day also. Maybe Dorothy Day might be the third best kept secret. I recall when I was going to give a presentation on Dorothy Day a couple of years ago, I mentioned it to the student, and the student says, oh, well, that's easy. She was a famous movie star in the 50s, Dorothy Day. Well, who was this student thinking of? And again, people of my age would know that, right? Doris Day, okay. So, big difference. Anyway, I think let me start this here. So here we have Catholic social teaching. It looks very complex, doesn't it? But it will all be clear to you, you know, after today's presentation. As I said, we're going to bring the two together. We're going to talk about Vatican Council, and we're going to talk about Catholic social teaching. We're also going to talk about Dorothy Day, and I showed you this quick video at the beginning which kind of sums up her life, which Tom Cornell will get at to a little bit later. Now, again, I know that there's a lot of thought right now and focus on the new Pope, and rightfully so. It's been a remarkable 3 weeks for the Church, and I anticipate the audience maybe wants to hear something about this. And it shouldn't be hard because there's been a lot of connections made between the new Pope and his identification with the poor, which has a lot to do, of course, with Catholic social thought. Now, it remains to be seen if he's equally serious about securing economic justice for the poor, which has something to do with Catholic social thought as well. Catholic social thought just isn't charity. It also is pushing the envelope. And Dorothy Day, of course, did that very well. So my purpose here today, then, is, first of all, to review a little bit of Vatican II, because some of you are new to this. Some of you maybe weren't paying attention last time. So I'm going to give you a little quiz to begin. Then I'm going to cover some of the principal understandings of what is Catholic social thought. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tom Cornell, who's best qualified to talk about Dorothy Day, and then Father LoPinto will speak on some of the most important documents regarding Catholic social thought that emerged from the Council. Then we'll leave town and let you pick up the pieces, Professor Horowitz.
Yeah, we were going to have Tom Cornell go last, but it doesn't matter.
No, he's going second.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So, what do we recall from last time? Okay, here's your quiz. Okay, I can see you're poised. First, the easy one. Vatican II met between what years? Hint, this is the 50th anniversary. Okay, so.
63.
What do you got?
63.
Actually, 62 through 65, so we're kind of a year late in commemorating this. Okay. Who was the Pope that called? Yes? Next answer. John the 23rd. Okay, John the 23rd. And he called for what was called a aggiornamento, which means updating. He wanted an updating of the church. So again, what were some of the important changes that we identified the last time about what changed within the church after Vatican II? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Abby.
Well, priests began to face the congregation rather than oppose, and Catholics became more universal in the sense that they weren't their own culture anymore.
Very good, very good. So there was a difference in the choreography of the Mass, the liturgy. There were changes in the liturgy in terms of the way the priests faced the congregation. Of course, you were permitted to say the Mass in your own local language, in the vernacular, and that was a big breakthrough. I remember when I was a server in the 50s, and I had to recite the prayers in Latin, and I would say, "Adelum quili tifica juventutem meum." I had no idea what I was saying. I know. Maybe Father could tell me what I was saying, but
Come to the altar with joy.
okay, there you go. Okay, so it shows you again how how things probably were better to change. All right. So and again, Abby mentioned that the church became more ecumenical. It tried to repair relations between other religions, especially Jewish-Catholic relations. I think we still have a way to go in that. It redefined the church, really, also. It made the church more expansive. When we think about pre-Vatican church, it was more like the hierarchy. Oh, the church is a hierarchy. But documents from the Vatican II defined the church much more expansively. They called the church the people of God. And the laity were considered co-equal, with the clergy when it came to looking at the church and the responsibilities that we had as laity, and carrying out the mission of the church. Practicing the faith just wasn't personal salvation. No, it had to do, again, with engagement with the world. And, of course, that has a lot to do with Catholic social thought. Okay, so I know there's a lot of disagreement over the council and its aftermath. You get little cartoons like this about Vatican II wrecked the church, something like that. And again, it's legitimate because there's different interpretations of the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. The traditionalists say that the liberals went too far. They diluted the doctrine of the church, or they want to dilute it even more. They diluted Catholic identity. What does it mean to be a Catholic now? So you get that criticism, and then the liberals go in the other direction and accuse the traditionalists of turning back the clock, trying to reverse the real change, that came with Vatican II. A lot of times they put the last two popes, in that category, Benedict, and then John Paul II. So Vatican II reversed or renewed the church's today's topic, which is Catholic social thought. But again, there's been a lot of disagreement over that, and I'll give you one example from the last presidential campaign. We see vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan with what he called his path to prosperity, which was his budget that he submitted. And he said that it was very consistent with Catholic social thought. Ryan is a very serious Catholic, by the way. Well, why was he saying this? Well, because Catholic social thought has an underlying principle called subsidiarity, which basically says, let the more local levels of government or any agency closer to the people accomplish what the people need. Don't allow higher levels, again, to do what the people themselves or local institutions should do. And, that has, power in its own right. But the problem, again, was with Ryan's budget. which was deeply criticized by the Catholic bishops in this country, it eliminated about 62% of the cuts that he called for went to federal agencies that served the poor. So they said, no, he's not following Catholic social thought. He's flouting, Catholic social thought. He's not about protecting the poor and the vulnerable. So in letters to Congress, various church leaders, describe Ryan's budget as failing the basic moral test and fundamentally, I'm quoting them, fundamentally at odds with Catholic social teaching. And they also point to that concept of subsidiarity. Well, another part of subsidiarity is that if local institutions can't accomplish what is needed, then the federal government has a role in providing the resources necessary to assist those that are in need. But again, this is very consistent again with the Republican conservative view of limited government, and Paul Ryan is in that camp. The other thing that we recall from the presidential campaign was Nuns on the Bus. They traveled around the country basically criticizing Ryan's budget. But just as important, they reminded Americans that Catholic social thought is pro-life. But pro-life in the fullest sense of the term, from conception to natural death, and then life in between, see? And too often, at least they said, and some Catholics say, the church has forgotten about that. They become fixated on this notion of contraception, for example, and of course, rightfully so on abortion. But the nun said, yes, pro-life means opposition to abortion on demand, but pro-life in its fullest sense is also a commitment to human rights. And that means decent housing, food and nutrition, sufficient health care, equal rights, and economic justice for the poor. That is Catholic social thought. So as you see, there's a lot of different interpretations you see of Catholic social thought, which comes from people with very sincere beliefs, people with legitimate differences, looking at the same documents. And you have to remember, Catholic social thought isn't necessarily a blueprint, it's a guideline, when it comes to interacting with the world. So there's a lot to say about Catholic social thought, and just a review here. It's Catholic social thought is papal encyclicals on the rights of labor, and this goes back to the 1890s. Catholic social thought are papal statements outlining the responsibility of rich nations to poor nations. You'll find that in various letters of the Pope and also the bishops. Catholic social thought is also bishops in Wisconsin speaking out against the governor of Wisconsin, who decided in an economic crisis for the state that he would limit the collective bargaining rights of public sector employees. Well, the Catholic bishops, led by Wisconsin Bishop Listecki, issued a statement affirming the rights of workers. No, this goes back to the documents I showed you before, that workers have a basic right to unionize. So again, he was drawing upon a long tradition of Catholic social thought when he presented that position. And then more recently, we have the United States Council of Catholic Bishops issuing statements about comprehensive immigration reform and the need to protect the safety nets, that are being chipped away by anti-government cutbacks. Most recently, I think this was in the last month, they issued a statement warning about the sequester that we're going through right now, that they hope that it would not undermine giving necessities to government assistance to those in need. And then, lest we forget, Catholic Charities is a very important part, of Catholic social thought. Catholic Charities, in this case, of Brooklyn and Queens, which is represented here with Msgr. LoPinto, and I think some people in the audience. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So this is all Catholic social thought. It's concern for economic justice. It's concern for ministry to the needy. And it's the extraordinary work that many of these church institutions perform on those fronts. But yet there's been fear and a concern, I think, that the hierarchy has been overly preoccupied with moral theology, sexuality, and that this message seems to have been lost. As I said at the beginning, it's a secret, in terms of the church. As one contributor to the New York Times said, that maybe with Francis I, there's some hope now And maybe it's a historical moment because maybe the church will, quote, dwell less in the bedroom and more in the soup kitchen. So that might sum up, you know, the way some people feel. So he also said, again, there's a close connection again with Francis and the saint. As you know, Francis was the saint for the poor. And even in his first homily, Pope Francis said that he wanted the church to be a poor church, a church that is, quote unquote, for the poor. And there's examples from his early life in Argentina, you know, where he seems to carry this out. Although I think you sometimes read too much into that he rode the bus, you know, instead of, you know, in the limousine. You know, he lived simply. He had an apartment, you know, as opposed to, you know, a big mansion. But I think a lot of people see significance in the name that he chose, see, Francis, who is the patron saint of the poor, actually. And again, it's noteworthy to know that Francis connects with another person that we're going to speak of today with Tom Cornell, Dorothy Day, because, well, we'll talk about this later. Dorothy was inspired by St. Francis, and one person said, quote, if Francis I is serious about the poor, he should canonize Dorothy Day. And again, why? Because she was inspired by Francis, but more important, because Day practiced the principles that are fundamental to Catholic social thought every day in her life. She practiced the works of mercy, assisting those in most need. You might be familiar with the Catholic Worker Movement, which has a soup kitchen that it runs 4 days a week on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but they're also very much foursquare on a lot of other social issues. So they combine charity with social justice. And again, they believe that social justice, charity isn't enough, that it's not just enough to feed the hungry, it's equally important to challenge the economic structures that keep people poor and hungry. As I remember from a video on Dorothy Day that I showed to my class a while ago, she said, I'm not sure if this is true, but it certainly hits home, if you feed the poor, you're a saint. If you ask why they are poor, you're a communist. So, again, I think that kind of sums things up. But I'm not here to canonize Dorothy Day, but it's really impossible to seriously talk about Catholic social thought without speaking of Day and the Catholic Worker Movement. And now I'm going to present Tom Cornell to pick up the pieces, you know, after I've left them.
I first met Dorothy Day when someone put this book in my hands in 1953, early in 1953. It was just published in 1952, and it's never been out of print. It is available in Italian, and German, and French, and Spanish, and Polish. I don't know what else. It's been published twice in Italian. And The Long Loneliness. So let me see. Get a hold of a copy and read it. It's really a classic. It is a religious classic. It is recognized as such. The Long Loneliness. Uh-oh. Doesn't work. Another book that just came out called All Is Grace, published by Orbis, by Jim Forrest. It's the third version of his biography of Dorothy Day. He's been writing it for 50 years, and I've known him all that time or longer. It's a masterpiece. It's selling very, very well. It's just out, and it's in its third printing already. And Cardinal Timothy Dolan bought 155 copies, and when he went to see Benedict for the last time, Pope Benedict of blessed memory, he gave Benedict a copy of Jim Forrest's biography, All Is Grace, and apparently Benedict read at least some of it because he mentioned Dorothy Day in his Ash Wednesday sermon. He mentioned 3 people who were examples of authentic Christian discipleship for our age, Dorothy Day being one of them. Now this astounds me. It simply astounds me because when I first was attracted to the Catholic Worker Movement, my Jesuit advisors, very fine men, they all told me, be careful. She is a materialist, not a formal heretic. she's a Jansenist and a rigorist, and you'll get into trouble. Well, they were wrong about the first two, but they were right about to get into trouble. I've been jailed several times and imprisoned once. I do have a pardon, by the way. So that if I apply for a job here and it says, have you ever been convicted of a felony, I can legally write no. And Jimmy Carter gave me and everybody else convicted of nonviolent offenses against the Selective Service Act during the Vietnam period. He gave them all, keeps all pardons. That's getting back to Dorothy. Dorothy was arrested several times. The first time when she was 19 years old in front of President Harding's White House for the women's vote. And she participated in a fast, a water fast, taking nothing but water, for about 10 days in Occoquan prison. And I want to read you just a little bit of what she wrote at that time. I think it's page 78, yes. When you fast for any long period of time, it changes your whole perception. It's really a very difficult experience. You get subclinical scurvy in about 3 days' time. And you begin to, your perception of reality changes somewhat. I lost all consciousness of any cause. I had no sense of being a radical, of making protest against the government, of carrying on a nonviolent revolution. I could only feel darkness and desolation all around me. I lost all feeling of my own identity. I reflected on the desolation of poverty, of destitution, of sickness and sin. That I would be free after 30 days meant nothing to me. I would never be free again, never free, when I knew that behind bars all over the world there were women and men, young girls and boys suffering constraint, punishment, isolation, and hardship for crimes of which we were all guilty. The mother who had murdered her child, the drug addict, who were the mad, who were the sane? Why were prostitutes prosecuted in some cases and in others respected and fawned upon? People sold themselves for jobs, for the paycheck, and if they only received a high enough price, they were honored. If their cheating, their theft, their lie were of colossal proportions, if they were successful, they met with praise, not blame. Why were some caught and others not? Why were some termed criminals and others good businessmen? What was right? What was wrong? What was good and evil? I lay there in utter confusion and misery. That's pretty powerful writing. Well, that's Dorothy. She was a very powerful personality and utterly authentic. Why are there so many poor? This is a question she asked. Why are they so poor, and why are they so poor for so long? And now we would say even for generations, because social mobility in this country is over. Dorothy felt haunted by God all her life. That little series from Los Angeles is full of mistakes. But from a child, she had a sense of the presence of God somehow, and she fled from it. Her family was Episcopalian by tradition. She was baptized, but her family very seldom went to church, any kind of church. But Dorothy remembers as a small child during a rainstorm going up to the attic of the home that they were living in Oakland, California, and just sitting there with the big old-fashioned family Bible in her hands and just turning the pages, not really reading it, but having the sense that it was holy, something sacred, something holy. She began to accompany a friend of hers to a Methodist church. And then she got what she says was kind of excessively pious. And it took a strange form. I believed, but I did not know what I believed in. I became disgustingly, proudly pious. I sang hymns with the family next door. I prayed on my knees by my bed. I asked my mother why we did not pray and sing hymns, and got no satisfactory answer. No one went to church but me. I was alternately lonely and smug. At the same time, I began to be afraid of God, of death, of eternity. As soon as I closed my eyes at night, the blackness of death surrounded me. I believed, and yet I was afraid of nothingness. What would it be like to sink into that immensity? If I fell asleep, God became in my ears a great noise that became louder and louder and approached nearer and nearer to me until I woke up sweating with fear, shrieking for my mother. I fell asleep with her hand in mine, her warm presence by my bed. If she connected my fears with my religious attitude, she never spoke of it. This was the time of the San Francisco earthquake, and later on Dorothy didn't know whether the experience of the earthquake, which 1906, she was 9 years old at the time, whether that colored her sensibility, this phenomenon, this fear. She was told by learned people at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which she attended at the age of 16, that we really should have respect for religion because a lot of people need it. You wouldn't take a crutch away from a cripple, would you? Of course, we strong people don't need crutches. It's only cripples who need crutches. So suppress your religious attitude. Suppress your awareness of the presence of God. Get involved. Get up off your knees. Get to work. The way the Marxists would approach things. But she couldn't quite do it. She tried. She ran away from God. I fled him down the nights and down the days. A couple of years later, Eugene O'Neill would recite the 120 lines of the Hound of Heaven to her in his cups, and she would walk him home to his apartment and put him to bed. Some of Eugene O'Neill's biographies suggested that she did more than untie his shoes, but Dorothy intimated to me that there was nothing to that. There's so little time. What Dorothy anticipated in the social sphere was brought about into the forefront of the church by the Second Vatican Council. Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, number 40, says that the quest for perfection is not just for the professed religious, the consecrated nuns and the priests and the bishops, but for all Christians. Before, we were told as lay people, your obligation is to obey the 10 commandments of God and the 6 commandments of the church, and to perform the duties inherent in your state of life. If you are the father of a family, you have different obligations than, say, a celibate male or female. If you are a priest, you have different obligations. If you are a ruler, you have a set of obligations. But most of us, what we are supposed to do is obey the commandments, obey the authorities put over us, secular authorities as well as religious authorities. Obey the law. Now, the function of the church is to evangelize, it's not to civilize. To evangelize, not to civilize. But as a matter of fact, after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the church did civilize. For the sake of peace, the church taught people to obey legitimate authority. I don't know if you're quite aware of how rude, crude, and lewd our ancestors in the Western world were and after the fall of the Roman Empire. Chaos. We had to be taught how to live together in peace by obeying legitimate authority. Today, it's a different day. I believe that the church has an obligation to teach people today how, when to disobey authority by nonviolent means. Now, another thing that's come out of the Second Vatican Council is the new evangelization. What's new about the new evangelization? The old evangelization is looking inward, or rather looking outward, to bring the gospel to the Hindus in India and to the Buddhists in China, etc., etc. The new evangelization recognizes the fact that a lot of people are baptized but haven't yet been evangelized. They're baptized out of cultural necessity. If you're Italian, you're Catholic. If you're Irish, you're Catholic. That doesn't mean that you've ingested the New Testament. Doesn't mean that you've read the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't mean, well, it means something. It means supernatural grace. It means access to these things. But you have to go and get them. The new evangelization is to bring the gospel to those who are already baptized, who are already in the pews. What else is new about the new evangelization? Justice and peace. The Synod of Bishops, 1971, said that the preaching of the gospel today, there has to be, as a constitutive element, essential element, work for justice. Not just teaching about justice, not just talking about justice, but the works of justice. And since then, peace as well. The connection between peace and justice is inextricable. Dorothy Day was a pioneer in bringing the lay responsibility to the fore, and also the question, why are there so many poor? What are we going to do about this filthy, rotten system, as she put it? And I cede for the moment.
You hear a lot about the council. Get yourself a copy of the actual documents. This is one of the more recent publications of the council. The council began, as you heard, in 1962, and it was concluded in December of 1965. In the initial work of the council, there was a lot of confusion as to what they were there for and what they were going to accomplish. Some key words that were part of the introduction to the council, which I think influenced the council going forward. One of the words that you hear is aggiornamento. But there's a word that's even more important than aggiornamento, and that is ressourcement. Ressourcement was the conviction that one had to go back to the sources in order to go forward in the conversation. And so a good bit of the council was going back to the scripture and to the writing of the fathers. And it was out of that that then Pope John the 23rd commented that once you go back, once you again clean away all that has kind of gathered around what is the essential, you then take that and you bring it into conversation with the world in which you're living, so that the doctrine doesn't change, but the doctrine finds new ways of expression in keeping with the world in which you're living. That was the heart of what the council was about. The other part was to refocus the church, which had become very insular, into a dialogue with the world, because that's ultimately what evangelization is about. It's not merely, in a sense, indoctrinating people, but evangelization is about bringing the good news, the gospel, into conversation with the reality of the world at a particular time in its history, and seeing how that gospel can influence the decision-making processes that go on, both individually and communitarianly, corporately. And so in the council, shortly after it got underway, there was a real movement on the part of the bishops who had gathered to say, this is a unique opportunity for us to be pastoral. not so much to focus on doctrine and dogma as previous councils had, but to focus on the dialogue and its pastoral implications. In December of 1965, as the council was coming to an end, there was, in a sense, the realization, the culmination of a lot of very important work. And I think when you look at that, and you look particularly at the social doctrine of the church, that social doctrine which was there from the beginning, from the earliest of days, when you look at that, it really got, I think, culminated in two documents that came out of the council. And they were adopted and promulgated in the closing of the council in December of 1965. And that was the Declaration on Religious Liberty and the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. The Declaration on Religious Liberty lifted up the rights of the human person. It, in a sense, highlighted the rights of the human person and defended the rights of the human person to, in a sense, go forward with religious practice as they deemed appropriate. It's a kind of a quick piece, but in a sense what it said is that at the heart of the reverence and respect that a human person is entitled to, and the human community is entitled to, is the notion of freedom. And that freedom must be respected as a person journeys through life. So you can't impose a certain set of beliefs or practices on a person. It has to be an evolving process to which they come in freedom to take ownership of. Now, this was a radical position because prior to the council, the basic promulgation of the church was error has no rights. And so you had then almost an obligation to impose the truth. And one of the ways that you did that was in relationship with government entities, where you would have the Catholic faith imposed on the people as the only legitimate, recognized faith in a particular country that would allow for practice. And so you had many, many situations, unfortunately, where people were persecuted because they did not adhere to a particular faith. Well, this document breaks that, breaks it radically, and begins really to bring forward the whole notion of freedom as an essential in the life of every human person. It also, and again, brings out the notion of evangelization, because it says the church is not to impose, but the church is to evangelize. The church is to teach, okay? And in a sense to encourage the development of understanding on the part of people so that they can come in freedom to embrace the truth, and embracing the truth to translate that into the decisions and ways of life. The other document, which even was more impressive, was the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. That document begins with a phrase that has become literally the heart of the social doctrine of the church. And that is the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of every human person. They are the joys, the hopes, the griefs, and the anxieties of the church. The church identified itself with the human community and committed itself to be a participant in the struggle for human dignity. That, in a sense, becomes the essence of that document, speaking about the dignity of the human person. But the other interesting thing that they did is they set up what I would call a paradigm, in the sense of acknowledging the particular dignity and how that, in a sense, flows out from our sacred tradition. But then they went to a second part of the document and they said, but there are specific issues. And these issues are ongoing and developing. And so rather than tell you what you should think in regard to any one of these particular issues, we invite you to dialogue, to bring into play our tradition with the realities of life at any particular time. And they listed certain critical issues. The issue that came out foremost was the issue of peace. There's a whole section of that document that relates to the issue and the pursuit of peace in the relationships between nations. They address the issue of disarmament, and they speak very forcefully about the need to transfer resources from arms to people. Because again, the whole basis of Catholic social thought is the worth, the value, the dignity of every human person without distinction. And so peace became one of the key pieces that they addressed. And they said there are many issues, but we're going to address peace, and we're going to address poverty, the issues of economics, the plight of the poor. And so those were kind of critical. Out of that, and there were two events that took place that very much influenced that focus. One is another 50th anniversary that comes up this month. And that is...
Terry's on my birthday.
Right. April 11th.
1934 for me.
Right, in 1963. John the 23rd became aware that he had cancer. He knew that he would not live much longer. He also was very determined as to the direction the council should take. Matter of fact, he gave a radio address shortly before the council opened. It was very clear that there was a twofold purpose to the council, namely peace and social justice. And so he issued an encyclical, which is a papal letter, unique because it did not go to the bishops and the clergy, but it was addressed to people of goodwill throughout the world. And in that document, Pacem in Terris, he proclaims the rights of the human person. It's the first time that it had been done in such a clear way, and interestingly enough, it actually coincided or was in sync with the universal doctrine or Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. And so this was the church, through his writing, affirming these rights: the right to life, the right to decent housing, to education, to food, to shelter. And he spoke of primary and secondary rights. And it again, throughout that, is basically saying that it's only when civil society embraces the worth, the value of the individual and their right to live in community, and then is respectful of these rights and builds systems in support of these rights, that you actually have a true journey to peace. And so that was one document that was. The other was, as I say, John died in June of 1963, and he was succeeded by Paul VI. And Paul VI in the 1964, in the October 4th of 1964, the feast of St. Francis, Paul VI did the unthinkable, in that he left Rome and came here to the United States, and in particular came to New York to address the United Nations, the General Assembly of the United Nations. This was, in a sense, unheard of for him to do something of this nature. It not only lifted up the United Nations as a key international organization whose primary purpose was the peaceful resolution of disputes. He gave a marvelous address in which he cried, "War, war, never again," and appealed with all the force that he had, appealed to the nations of the world to pursue a path to peace. Now, again, a lot of this goes against the background of the world in which we were living at that time, and it showed, again, the spirit of the council, that the teachings of the church were not exclusive within the church, but were really designed for this dialogue to take place between the church as a member of the world and the world at large, with the sincere hope that this would lead to a journey of justice and a journey of peace for all peoples throughout the world. These documents in 2004, the church, again, as a result of the council pulling all of this together, published for the first time a compendium of the social doctrine of the church. It's a marvelous collection showing the consistency of the church's path in regard to the issues of peace and justice. And it gives you, again, a collection of all of those documents as they have been issued throughout the life of the church. Another one that comes in is a commentary that was published at the same time, which is more U.S. focused, and another book which was edited by Tom Massaro and Tom Shannon, American Catholic Social Teaching. Because the church in the United States, which is often accused of being in the bedroom, has actually spent a lot more time outside of the bedroom, engaged in dialogue and conversation in the political arena for the purpose of trying to create a more civil and a more just society. In 1919, I think it was, Father Tom Ryan issued a document in the name of the bishops on social reconstruction. And that document spoke about the rights of people to organize. It spoke about just wages. It spoke about the rights of people for sick leave. It spoke about many of the issues, pension, the need for people to have time for recreation. Interestingly enough, that document quietly but became a basis for much of the legislation that came in the New Deal. Social Security, other types of protections for workers. So you have a whole history of the church out there. Subsequent to the council, you had the document, Tom spoke about this the last time, the challenge of peace, and you had the document on economic justice, issued here in the United States around those issues, along with documents on racism and all of the other challenges that we face. So it's a very comprehensive. It is, as Dr. Arnold said, a secret, but it's unfortunately a secret that, as I say, needs to be broken open, because it's probably the richest part of the church's history. Thank you. Pope Francis is new to the scene. He does have a history as the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He also has a history as a leader within the Jesuit community. And the Jesuits certainly have been in the forefront of the church's work in the area of justice. And he certainly has manifested that in his days as the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires in very simple things that he's done. I mean, Professor Arnold made a point, he rides the bus and the subway. Well, that's a nice thing to do. More importantly, he made a point in his ministry to center that ministry on the poor in the barrios of Argentina, particularly in the Buenos Aires area. And he directed the priests to leave their rectories and to go out into the barrios and the favelas, working among the people, particularly the poor. Okay, so he was a great advocate. He was certainly a great advocate in the time of economic crisis in Argentina not too long ago, which Tom made the mention. He condemned the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for many of their restrictions that they were placing upon Argentina in that great time of difficulty, which literally put a greater burden on the poor. And his concern has been that many of the economic decisions that are made, particularly through these institutions and through the process of globalization, are on the backs of the poor. They are the ones who suffer the greatest burden from much of this economic policy. And Tom also made mention of Benedict. And interesting, Benedict did propose in his last documents, some of his last documents, he did propose a new model for economic policy. And it was based upon the notion of generosity and graciousness. Actually, I think that's the word he used, was graciousness, that you need an economy based on graciousness, which is that you recognize that what you have is a gift that's been entrusted to you for the use of the common good. That will not get a lot of great play in today's world.
How do you suppose it would how would it strike you if she said, oh, that's a great idea. Let's put about 25% of the income that comes from the Catholic worker into my canonization. What do you suppose? Suppose his closest comrades came to Francis, what was his name?
Francis of Assisi.
Yes, his family name.
Oh, gee, what was it? Bonaparte? No.
No, not Bonaparte.
No.
Hey, Frankie, do you think we ought to propose you for canonization after you die? What do you think? How would you?
Oh,
He would say, of course not. Of course, don't think about that. Don't even think about things like that. But Dorothy is dead now. She doesn't belong to Dorothy Day. She belongs to the church and to the world. And she's to be held up as a model of authentic discipleship. Canonization is not to honor somebody. Honoring somebody has nothing to do with it. We need the example of Dorothy Day today, a woman who went to jail 8 times in the cause of peace and freedom, for workers' rights, against the war-making machine, and that's what we have to learn to do. We have to learn to resist the forces of evil in the corporate structures. And it's going to take a price. Dorothy is no longer the lunatic fringe. Dorothy is now right in the center. Now, who proposed her for canonization? A 27-year military veteran, a retired rear admiral named Cardinal Archbishop John O'Connor. Who backed it up? Egan, Cook, and now Tim Dolan. Tim Dolan bought 155 copies of All Is Grace. I told you that earlier. Cardinal, the Archbishop of New York. When I applied for conscientious objection in 1956, the question was open. It wasn't settled. It was settled at Vatican II, definitively. The words conscientious objection were not used in the document because, I don't want to give offense when I say this, because the word conscientious objection, or conscientious objector, has a kind of Protestant smell to it.
Has a good smell.
A kind of Protestant smell to it. No offense meant to the Mennonites and the Brethren and the Quakers and the Anabaptists, not at all, because we owe them a debt. They kept a stream of Christian pacifism alive when we let it go down to, well, quite marginalized. The Franciscans kept it going. But We owe them a debt, the left wing of the Protestant Reformation period. But the words conscientious objection did show up in Evangelium Vitae.
Right.
What year, I've forgotten.
That was...
And it was in the context of abortion.
In the 80s. In the 80s.
You're obliged to defy the law when it comes to abortion. You're a medical student, OBGYN, and your medical school decides that you must participate in an abortion or you can't get your degree. What do? You refuse.
And that actually, Tom, grew out of the document on religious liberty.
The document on religious liberty and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are congruent in many ways, but they have a different basis. The basis for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is simply the consensus of right-minded people at the time. But the basis for Catholic human rights theory in Parliamentaries is nature.
Natural law.
Natural
and
law.
Revelation.
But natural law is conceived that creation has a meaning. The other tradition comes from Democritus and Epicurus. Creation has no meaning. It is chaos. It's chaos against logos. But that's another layer.
I think there's a number of ways that can be done. Part of the difficulty with that today is life has become far more compartmentalized, so that you have poor communities and you have communities of wealth, but there's no interaction. There were some interesting experiments that went on in the past. There was you might remember him, Monsignor Tom Fox, here in the New York metropolitan area. And one of the things that he did was to link the communities by having processes of sharing, where people would go from one community to work alongside the people in the other community, not to do for them, but to do with them, and to see if you couldn't break open the barriers and, in a sense, create relationships. Brian is here from Catholic Charities. We do something along those lines. Matter of fact, with Emily, last 2 weeks ago, I guess, students from here went to work at a senior center up in the Bushwick, Williamsburg, Greenpoint community, interacting with the seniors as they redeveloped their center. And prior to that, they went and they did a food pantry in the Red Hook community. It's not, and this is where subsidiarity comes in. Okay? You know, if you did everything at the level of Washington, in effect, it all becomes very abstract. And people can object and argue about the abstract. It's concretizing things, bringing people together, allowing them to see the unity that exists between them, and then working together around those issues that makes the change. I mean, that's certainly one of the great struggles in our country right now, is you have an East Coast and a West Coast that are, in a sense, mixed communities, because there's more intensity. I always like to use the example, and I don't want to be going over time. I like to use the example of those of you who live in Brooklyn, of Coney Island Avenue. Coney Island Avenue, if you know, runs from down Brighton Beach all the way up to Prospect Park. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. There are buses that run up and down on Coney Island Avenue. Take a map out, particularly with the demographic studies, and see who lives along that avenue. Okay? You have people from Eastern Europe, Russia, and other areas. You have people from the Middle East. You have people from Israel. You have people from the Caribbean. If you take them where they live literally at war with one another. Somehow, They ride day in and day out up and down Coney Island Avenue on the bus. And they get along. When was the last time you read about somebody being murdered on the bus that runs up and down on Coney Island Avenue? When you have to interface with people, you see something different. You see their humanity, and you recognize it's not any different from your own humanity. And that becomes a bond. And it's a bond that can make a world of a difference. When you keep people isolated and apart from one another, and then you build up the rhetoric that shows divisiveness and difference, tribalism, you're going to have continued problems. And that's why, in a sense, the promulgation of the council, which was so amazing, was that we are the world. Okay? All of a sudden, in that one room, in the aula of St. Peter's, the world gathered. And when the world gathered, the conversation moved. It moved from a lot of internal nonsense to the concerns of the human family, and that we had an obligation to be at work on their behalf with them. You know, that's part of, in a sense, it's a great model for us to move forward with